Poverty, for me, it has a face, and the first step, I think, for a smart government, smart local government, is to acknowledge that face. And then I think that the first problem is the failure to see the people. And in that regard, I don't think that any more example could have been emblematic of our local government, forget state or federal, in its failure to see the people than in the exercise of the school closure process that took place about a year and a half ago. In that particular exercise of the school closure process, certainly understanding the need for a very economically challenged and distressed school board and unified school district to try to reconcile their budget shortfall, but the communities where they sought first to help really try to reconcile that shortfall were the communities that happened to be the most impoverished in San Francisco. So poverty, as I understood for many years, and as I have felt its impact and tried, like so many other activists, to try to make sense out of it and turning around its impacts, it's a bleeding wound. It does not heal by itself. It continues to fester, and in its wound itself, it lowers the resistance of a particular community and of the environment and the climate around that. It is a opportunistic type infection. It is something that does not go away without sort of the empowerment that is both infused by government and by the people, and hopefully more by the people driven itself. If not, it continues then to such distress and create such a beleaguered environment within that particular community that it makes perfect sense that we would continue to see this unmitigated and unabated sort of public safety and violence crisis emanate from the very same communities that are having the exact same challenges with schools or their anchor institutions being taken away, public housing, which is completely almost at the F level as graded by the federal government, which is a pretty low bar kind of grade, by the way, or with policies that have been imposed upon those same very communities by the quasi-state institution, the redevelopment agency. Keep in mind, redevelopment, housing authority, and school district are either state or federal institutions, all very disempowering in its own infrastructure, not necessarily designed to intrinsically try to empower a community, but yet it deflects the responsibility on any of us here and you to try to make sense out of the very challenges that really this isn't supposed to happen to San Francisco. And this is what I find fault with our so-called reputation as being progressive, because the fact that poverty in this city, which is really calculated at the same level as poverty in Birmingham, Alabama, if you rely on the federal census level, we don't recognize poverty in San Francisco. We're way too cosmopolitan or chic to acknowledge the fact that within communities, whether it be in the southeast sector or in my district of the Western Addition or in the Tenderloin or the Mission, that the first failure of our government is to not see its people. And in that regard, so is the translation of our policy making unto itself. So if we want to talk about brass tacks and what we do, for me, I think the menu is pretty clear-eyed. And in that menu, I believe wholeheartedly that because we've seen ever since the Reagan administration and continued by the Clinton administration and thereafter, their detachment from responsibility of public housing, we should take public housing over in San Francisco. We should take it. It was only until recently in a committee that I'm part of that I've shared, and not knowing that, frankly, coming into elected office, a cornerstone of my time as being a supervisor was going to go to homicide and murder scenes at all time of the day to try to make sense out of why we have such a lackluster response to a problem that was often assigned as being an African-American problem, and why these crimes weren't being even resolved or even prosecuted, not alone investigated. But the fact is that much of where the high concentration of the crime was occurring was either on or contiguous to public housing. And the fact is nobody was willing to admit it. And the fact is that we had a vulnerable population, approximately about 30,000 people in San Francisco, who've been standing there defenseless and made vulnerable because we didn't have the city infrastructure or resources that we were willing to assign to a very area who's part of San Francisco, but frankly, we wouldn't admit. And so people would die, and people's whose death or victimization would occur would go unnoticed or unresolved, either in the eyes of law enforcement. And the same with sort of the degradation of the housing itself, where now we're still faced with the very pirouette of trying to figure out, do we wait for the federal government to bail us out, which we know a Bush administration won't, and I'm not quite so secure of the feeling that if there's a change in the White House to Democrat, they will either, quite frankly. So that means it's a flex. And so that means it deflects that kind of imagination and creativity to a local government response. I feel this way about the redevelopment agency. In 40 years that the redevelopment agency has been in existence of San Francisco, and based on the decision-making process of this agency, no decision has ever been overturned by the Board of Supervisors or by the mayor, because once decisions had ever been blessed by the Commission of the Redevelopment Agency in the birthing of the A2, or known as the redevelopment zone in the Fillmore in Japantown, what little spots there were in South of Market, and now the biggest rebirth of its agency in the Bayview Hunters Point, it will be a continuation of what we saw in the 60s through the 80s or up till now in the Fillmore, but it's just going to be sort of with a new panache. It's not going to be with eminent domain. Geez, big deal, what a concession. 2007, we're not using eminent domain. That's like giving blankets to the American Indians without smallpox. It's not a concession. What it means is that it's a disempowerment tool. And what we should do at the very minimum so that there is an accountability process built in so that we can no longer blame an institution that's removed from our own local government is to take that institution over. And this isn't unprecedented. Over half the county board of supervisors in California is the Redevelopment Agency Commission. It just so happens San Francisco took the wrong turn 30 years ago and decided it wanted a separate government. But it's because of that separate government where the failure in the system breeds bright. And it's the very system in itself that we don't hold accountable. So the people who are subordinate and subjected to those decisions, whether it be public housing and how they're assigned, or projects of redevelopment, who on the front end promise a certain marketing strategy that it's going to lift and empower a community, but we know in the back end they're going to be dislocated, it's because our local government, whether the mayor or the board of supervisors, blesses it simply by the consent of not being involved. And that's not acceptable, which is why I believe that if we want to tackle poverty, and if we want to tackle the root causes, we have to be honest by the very faces of those people who are implicated and who are being affected. It's from crime. It's from schools and the degradation of those institutions that are being taken away. It's about housing. It's also about workforce development. The very fact is that in San Francisco, out of our own general fund, we spend $25 billion a year for workforce development. It's matched by another $25 million. It's $50 million a year for workforce development agencies. Right now, both Supervisor Amiano and myself commissioned an audit, which will be out in a week, to try to make sense of who the hell is getting work out of this, because we can't figure it out. For $50 million, we believe we should be getting a greater bang for our buck, and if there's failure within that, then there should be some accountability for it too. But as the moral goes on this story, we throw good money after bad and bad after good without not understanding where the money's going. So as it's sort of splayed over 8 different agencies, under the rubric of the mayor, by the way, of all this money that's going out, I still can't tell you all that money where our people are going to work. That's why if this audit gives the notice that I think it will, it's time to consolidate the workforce development agencies in this city so that we have some control and that